Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 23rd Annual Fall for the Book Festival. These free online events run the last 2 weeks of October and can be rewatched at any time on Crowdcast or the festival's YouTube channel. To follow us on Crowdcast, you can click on the Fall for the Book icon above this window and then click follow, or you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. The link will be provided in the chat box. My name is Sun Young Park. I'm a history professor at George Mason University, and I'll be moderating today's panel, just titled Breaking the Victorian Glass Ceiling. We're joined by Emily Midorikawa and Olivia Campbell, and I'll begin by providing an introduction of both authors. Emily Midorikawa is a writer and journalist whose work has been published in venues such as the Daily Telegraph, the Paris Review, the Times of London, and the Washington Post. She previously co-authored a book titled A Secret Sisterhood, The Literary Friendships of Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot, and Virginia Woolf, published in 2017. Her most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is titled Out of the Shadows, 6 Visionary Victorian Women in Search of a Public Voice. It tells the stories of influential women who gained fame and fortune by using their clairvoyant gifts to break gender and class barriers. Our second speaker is Olivia Campbell, who is a journalist, essayist, and author whose work focuses on the intersections of medicine, women, history, and nature. Her work has appeared in outlets such as The Atlantic, New York Magazine, The Washington Post, The Guardian, Scientific American, and many others. This is her first book titled Women in White Coats: How the First Women Doctors Changed the World of Medicine. And it tells the stories of 3 pioneering women who broke gender boundaries and earned medical degrees, creating medical care for women by women. So we'll begin by having these 2 authors provide brief overviews of their books. So the subjects, themes, and questions they addressed, the conclusions they drew, perhaps what they learned from writing these works. And we'll then be taking questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to type your question to the chat box or the Crowdcast Q&A space at any time, and they'll be conveyed to me. So Emily, perhaps we can begin with you, and you can give us a brief survey of what Out of the Shadows was about.
Yes, so Out of the Shadows is about 6 enterprising women of the 19th century who became famous thanks to their ability, or their apparent ability, depending on how you look at this, to contact the dead. So the first 3 are the Fox sisters, 3 sisters from upstate New York who burst into the public consciousness in the mid-19th century, thanks to the mysterious knocking sounds, or spirit raps as they were known, that accompanied their presence. So initially, the sisters were demonstrating these talents at local séances, but quickly their reputations grew and they started to pack out concert halls with, big audiences all clamoring to see what the sisters could do. By the summer of 1850, they were in New York City, the culmination of their first big public tour. And over that summer, they really became like the talk of the town. You had newspaper editors, significant intellectual thinkers of the day, celebrities all beating a path to their door to see what the Fox sisters, what all the fuss was about. And this, of course, generated wider publicity, and the movement that grew up around the Fox sisters became known as modern spiritualism. I'll move swiftly on to the next woman I'd like to talk about now, Emma Harding Britten. She was a British woman who had a sort of theatrical background. She'd been an actress and performer on the London stage and had eventually ended up on Broadway. It's fair to say that she didn't really set things ablaze with her theatrical career, but during her time in New York City, she became interested in spiritualism and became a spirit medium herself. And one of her specialities was trance lecturing. By this, I mean, she would get up on stage in front of a big crowd, give what were apparently very eloquent, engaging speeches. But rather than presenting this as her own words, she presented it as being words that were channeled from spirits, and significantly, quite often dead male spirits. And this allowed her to talk about quite controversial topics that would have been controversial anyway, whoever was talking about them, but particularly coming from the mouth of a woman. So I'm talking about things like politics in general, the need to abolish slavery, the plight of what she called fallen women, so women working as prostitutes. And eventually she became so popular as a speaker that she was drafted in to help with the campaign to re-elect Abraham Lincoln as president. And then after Lincoln's untimely death, she actually gave the first big public commemoration of Lincoln's life in New York City. Again, I shall move on to my next subject, Victoria Woodhull. She also found fame in New York City. She'd originally started out as what you might call a spiritual healer, so someone who apparently used their clairvoyant talents to heal the sick. But she really came to wider public notice when she arrived in New York City and started giving tips on the stock market to would-be investors based on, again, things she had heard from dead spirits. She seems to have done quite well at that, had quite a lucrative career, to the extent that her and her sister eventually set up the first female-owned brokerage firm on Wall Street. And not content to stop there, Victoria Woodhull then took the money she'd accrued, the influence she'd accrued, and decided to go for it and make a bid for the US presidency. So she was the first woman to run for president. And I think this was quite an audacious thing to do at the time, bearing in mind that women, they didn't have the vote, and she was actually, putting herself forward as someone who could lead the country. And it's quite interesting to look back at newspaper reports and see quite sort of how seriously this bid was taken, at least initially, which I think speaks volumes about her ambition. And then finally, the last woman in my book, Georgina Weldon, she was a British woman, slightly different from the other examples in that she wasn't a professional spirit medium. She was an active participant at séances. But she became famous because her husband sought to have her locked away in an asylum for various reasons, but one of them was that he'd fallen in love with another woman and wanted to get her out of the way. But obviously, to have someone put in an asylum, you need to show that they are mad or supposedly mad. And one of the things that was used to illustrate her madness was her interest in spiritualism. Thankfully for Georgina, she managed to evade capture when the doctors from the asylum came to her house and tried to forcibly cart her away. And then as a result of that, she, for reasons partly to do with wanting to exact revenge, I think, but also wanting to draw attention to the state of what they called the lunacy laws at the time, how easy it was to have someone shut away on quite flimsy evidence. She began to publicize her case, first in public speeches and then eventually through the law courts, drawing attention to, trying to sue everyone and thus drawing attention to everybody who'd been involved in this plot against her. And this was quite a novel thing at the time because she actually represented herself in court. So as in the case of Emma Harding Britten, there's a real novelty to a woman getting up on stage or getting up in a courtroom and speaking for themselves at the time. I could go on with this. There's much more I could say about all of these women, but I'm mindful of the time, so I will stop and hand over.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. Olivia, let's turn to you. Could you provide us an overview of Women in White Coats?
Yes, so my book is about three of the first women to earn medical degrees. So Elizabeth Blackwell is kind of the first. She's the first woman to earn her MD in America, first MD practicing in America. The second person is who Elizabeth Blackwell actually inspired. Elizabeth Blackwell went and did a tour of giving speeches in the UK. And so she inspired the other Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, to become a doctor as well. She was the first licensed woman physician practicing in England. And then we have Sophia Jex-Blake, who is a little bit younger and much fierier than the other two. And she is the first MD to be practicing in Scotland. So the second Elizabeth and Sophia kind of already knew each other a little bit through organizing with women's rights group in London, basically one of the first women's rights groups in London. They were both involved in, so they knew each other through that. Even before Sophia decided she wanted to become a doctor, they were friends. But so we have Elizabeth Blackwell goes first, and she gets, she decides she wants to become a doctor. She gets turned down by several dozen medical schools. Like no one wants to have her. No one wants to, for men, this is basically a formality at the time to apply to medical school in America, especially. It was not rigorous. It was essentially like getting an undergraduate degree is today. You just kind of go to a school for a couple of years and then, okay, you're a doctor now. So she was having a terrible time getting into any school, and she finally got into this little tiny country school, they call them in New York, Geneva College. And she was actually got in as a joke. They thought it was a practical joke. So the people, the administrators at the school said, okay, we don't want to be the ones to say no to a woman student applying. So we're going to let the students decide. So they go into the class and we're like, okay, guys, there's a woman who wants to come to school here. What should we say? They're like, oh, sure. Yeah, that's great. Whatever. They thought it was another school down the road playing a joke on them. They didn't think it was for real. So a few weeks later, here's this woman walking into the classroom. Oh, hey, here's Elizabeth Blackwell. So they're kind of like, oh, wow. Okay, what do we do now? Once she got into the school, it was kind of okay. They kind of saw her as an older sister type figure. She didn't have a lot of problems with sexism, like a lot of other women that came after her did. But as soon as she graduated, Geneva College shut their doors to further women. So next we have Elizabeth Garrett. So Elizabeth Garrett is really grumpy being at home, trying to take care of her parents' house and saying, I want to do more than this. I don't want to stay at home like women are supposed to. I want to go do something. So she goes to this lecture. First, she reads about Elizabeth Blackwell in a woman's magazine. Then she goes to Elizabeth Blackwell's lecture. And Elizabeth Blackwell basically is saying how amazing it is to be a woman and give back to your community, to have a job, to have a purpose in life, and how great that feeling is. And so she really tapped into that feeling that Elizabeth was having and feeling like, oh, I really want to be useful. I want to put my brain to use. So she decides, okay, I'm going to try to become a doctor. She has a terrible time also getting education. Most of the schools in the UK at this time are connected to a hospital. So you have a hospital and then the college is connected to it. So what she would do is she would go be like an assistant nurse. She'd go be like a trainee nurse at these hospitals. And then she would say, hey, can I go to this class? Okay, and hey, can I go to that class too? So she kind of, once they realize she's worming her way into the school and trying to become a student, they kick her out. So she does this several times at different hospitals, like each time gathering a few more credits, so eventually she gets all the credits she needs. She has to do a little bit of private study as well with tutors coming to her house. Luckily, her family is very wealthy and they can fund this. Elizabeth Blackwell didn't have the money. She had to pay for everything herself. She had to work at a different job teaching to earn enough money to be able to go to school. She wanted to go to school much sooner than she did. So Elizabeth Garrett finally gets her licensure through the Society of Apothecaries. So she's licensed to practice medicine. It's not an MD, but she does legally practice medicine in the UK. So she does this sets up a practice. She eventually does get her MD at the Sorbonne in Paris. She taught herself French in order to go to school there. But she just had a terrible time just trying to get those credits. And as soon as she got licensed, the Society for Apothecaries said no more women. They changed the terms and said no more women. So every time a woman got through, they're like, no, we're not having it. So Sophia is part of what's known as the Edinburgh Seven. Okay, so she decides she's going to become a doctor after a visit to Boston. Actually, she goes to a women's hospital in Boston. That is one of the students of Elizabeth Blackwell, one of her colleagues who set up a hospital there. And so Elizabeth's legacy is still inspiring, right? So she goes to the University of Edinburgh and says, okay, I want to take classes. Will you let me take classes? They're like, well, we'd have to set up totally separate classes for you, so we can't afford it. It would be too expensive for us because you're a woman. You can't be, in men's classes. She says, like, okay. She goes and finds an editor at the Scotsman newspaper, and he puts a little ad out that basically says, do any other women want to come and join Sophia at the university? If we have more people, then they can't say no, because the reason was it's only one woman, we can't afford to. So she gets 6 more women to come up and say, hey, we were interested in doing this with you. We'd love to try. So now the university can't say no because they've already given their first reason. They fight with the university for 4 years. It's much more rigorous to get an MD in the UK at this time than in America. You're doing much more training. it's much more legitimate. I mean, people in America, they would graduate without ever having, touched a patient or ever really being in a childbirth or anything, and then they're expected to go practice. But it's much more rigorous in the UK at the time. So these 7 women go through the whole course of study at the university, same as the men. And at the end of it, the university says, we're not going to give you the degree. Sorry, we can't do it. So for all this work and for nothing, basically. So these 3 women all knew each other through this whole time. They don't always get along. They had very different ideas. Elizabeth Garrett thought Sophia kind of really pushed the movement back by failing to get a degree. She was really angry about this, but they decide to put all their differences aside and work together, all three of them, to create the first women's medical school in London. So they founded the London School of Medicine for Women together, the 3 of them. It was Sophia's idea in the first place to do this. But while she was very fiery, had a temper, she wasn't necessarily the person you'd want to represent your school, right? So she kind of wasn't allowed to be attached to the school like publicly. Her name wasn't going to be in any of the publications, that kind of thing. I love her so much. She's a loudmouth, and she will say whatever she wants. She had the best comebacks I've ever heard. I was so jealous of her mind. It was brilliant. She was fat, she was lesbian, she is fabulous. And no one wanted that representing the school, right? So while she was away in Ireland, finally taking the exam for her MD, finally getting, licensed to practice in the UK, the school decides to put Elizabeth Garrett in charge instead of Sophia. So they kind of kicked her out while she was gone, basically, because they didn't really like her personality. So that kind of crushed her. She went off to Scotland and, started practicing there and established a women's hospital there. But just the pulling the rug out from under her like that, it's remembered as Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's hospital and college there. And it's not her college, it's Sophia's. So that's about the story there.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you for giving us these teasers and glimpses into your books. We're going to open this up really right away into a Q&A. So audience members, if you would like to ask a question, again, please type your question into the chat or the Crowdcast Q&A space. But while we get that going, let me begin with a question to get the discussion started and the conversation going. So could you both speak a bit about your initial inspirations for this book, for your books? What drew you to these topics and the particular women that you ended up studying? So Emily, perhaps we can start with you, thinking about how this book project came about.
Yes, so I think this will probably be familiar to lots of writers, lots of researchers. I first became interested in the Fox sisters. They were the first ones that came on my radar, really, thanks to research I was doing for my previous book. So I was in the New York Public Library reading letters from Harriet Beecher Stowe to George Eliot. And one of the Fox sisters crops up in these letters. Now, this book was not about spiritualism. It was not about the spirit world. It was about female literary friendship. And at the time, I was quite focused on what I was doing and sort of plowing ahead with that. But there was something about Stowe's description of Kate Fox, who she had actually met at a séance herself, Harriet Beecher Stowe being interested in all this sort of thing, that kind of stuck in my mind. And once I'd finished researching, writing, promoting that book, I returned to my notes on these letters and discovered a little bit more about the Fox sisters. And then through the Fox sisters, I found out about other spirit mediums of the time. And it was a whole world opened up to me. And then I started thinking, there could well be a book in here. I was particularly interested in women working within the spiritualism movement. I mean, there were male mediums as well. But it was a job that was often seen as being quite well suited for women because of ideas at the time about women being perhaps more emotional, more intuitive. And it was, I suppose, a rare arena where women could take quite leading roles, perhaps leading a mixed group with sort of men and women. And, obviously we've already talked about in the case of someone like Emma Harding Britten, getting up on stage and speaking in public, which would have been quite a novel thing at the time. And I think, there were many women I could have included in this book, but eventually I started to sort of hone in on these particular ones because it seemed that all of them were women who were in search of a public voice. they had different motivations for wanting to find that voice. Sometimes these were quite admirable motives. Sometimes they were more to do with self-promotion, and sometimes like a mixture of both. But I felt that this was quite an interesting arena in which women could speak in the Victorian era, and one that perhaps I felt had not been as sufficiently studied as it could have been.
Thank you. And Olivia, how about you? What was the initial inspiration for your book?
So the first thing I read about this, I've been writing about women's health and women's medicine for a long time. So the first thing I read about the history of this was a riot that happened near where I live outside of Philadelphia. So there's a riot in 1869, I believe it was, at the Philadelphia hospital. So about 30 students there's a women's medical college of Philadelphia. 30 students came to the hospital to see a clinical lecture. They had, been plugging along at their little women's college, but they really wanted to see these clinical lectures that the men had access to in the city and that they had always been turned down for. So the university finally relented and said, okay, you can bring a class to this lecture. So the men had been passing around notes in preparation for this, come and see the she doctors. So when the women show up on Saturday, there's like 300 guys up in the stands waiting for them. They're throwing spitballs, they're spitting tobacco on them, yelling epithets, yelling just nasty stuff at them, anything they can think of to try to get them to go away. And they just had to sit there through the whole thing. The lecture tried to go on. They're bringing administrators are coming in yelling at these men, and the men are like stomping and screaming through the whole thing. They, outbursts keep popping up, and they're like chasing them in the street at the end of it. And then I read about almost exactly a year later, in Edinburgh, Scotland, there was another riot that Sophia was a part of. A few women had shown up to an exam that they had to take. It was a mixed gender exam. The exams were not separate. And the women had been taking some classes with the men also, but some of their classes were all separate. But at this particular time, it was kind of like the argument was spilling into the community about whether women should be doctors or not. So there was students from the university as well as sort of community members there, and all these men in a giant, hundreds of men mob, basically waiting for them at the exam, throwing rotten produce and rotten eggs at them, throwing mud at them, covering their dresses in mud before the exam. And so they had to push in. They actually let a sheep into the exam room while it's going on to try and cause mayhem. And so they finally get through the exam and get out. Okay, they were also following them home and that kind of stuff. So I was really fascinated that these two were so similar. I was like, okay, there's something here that these two things would be happening. So that these really temper tantrums these men are having to share their space with women at the idea of women, studying and becoming a doctor. So I just wanted to know more. I wanted to dig and see what the full story was, what all these women went through in order to try to become a doctor during this era. And it was a lot. There's a lot of terrible stories of, families disown them. Your families, their mothers going into a depressive episode, becoming ill from being upset that their daughter would dare to go do something so grotesque as, medicine. They're desexing themselves. What are you doing? You're never going to get marriage proposals. You're ruining your chances. These kinds of things are being lobbed at them. So yeah, it was fascinating to really dig in. It's inspiring as much as it is really, enraging.
Yeah. Thank you, Olivia. And it's kind of, ironic because I think my parents would have been delighted if I had chosen to go to medical school today. I think, what really comes through in both of your books is just, controversies, right? Like controversies abound everywhere. And Emily, in thinking about your book, I was thinking about how the controversial nature of the subject matters probably still persists to the way these women are remembered or studied today. Because there is a conflicted legacy to 19th century spiritualism. Today there's perhaps a tendency to dismiss these women as charlatans, just something you address in your conclusion. And I wanted to just ask you how you respond to those kinds of critiques, that these women were just, preying on, vulnerable, gullible minds, and that they're not perhaps, the heroes that we demand of history.
Yes, so I think there's kind of a spectrum with the women in my book, and also just women within the spiritualism movement generally. Certainly there were people within the movement who it's hard to make a case that they were entirely genuine, because, you know, even if you believed in their powers, they were caught out lying on various occasions. So it's hard to make the case, in the case of the Fox sisters, that everything they said, everything they purported to do was genuine, because of just the contradictions in their own accounts and the way that they disagreed with each other. So you can obviously make that argument. I think, though, it was sometimes more subtle than that. And I sort of particularly think about the case of Emma Harding Britton with her trance lecturing. Now, obviously, one way of interpreting that is she wanted to talk about controversial topics. This was a neat way that she could convince people to listen to her as a woman, you know, by purporting that she's channeling the thoughts of dead male spirits. On the other hand, I think it's also possible that she genuinely believed that she was channeling spirits, or it may be somewhere sort of in the middle of those two. I mean, I think the topic she was speaking about at the time was so controversial that perhaps the only way she could explain to herself that she could address such unladylike topics really was that she was channeling something else rather than herself. So perhaps it was actually, you know, parts of her subconscious coming through, but that she wasn't able to sort of explain what she was doing to herself in any other way. So I think that's a possibility. I think in terms of you were asking sort of about the reputations of these women, I think one of the reasons that there's a tendency to gloss over them is that they don't really fit into neat narratives about female empowerment. They're not wholly heroic characters that can be admired, like, you know, in every sort of aspect of their personalities. I think there's something perhaps slightly embarrassing to people as well, you know, that they did make progress in many areas, you know, opening up all sorts of arenas for women, but perhaps not in the way that people would like. And I think that's, you know, I think that's maybe a problem that we do have these days, you know, a reluctance to want to study figures from the past, you know, that have any sort of aspects to their personality that seem unpalatable to us today. And I think by shutting ourselves off to that, it creates real problems. It means we're turning a blind eye to many areas of history that are worth studying.
Mm. So when you were looking at these particular case studies that you focus on, did you make a conscious decision about how you chose to address the quote unquote reality of what might have been happening during these seances or trance sessions and so on? Or did you just, I don't know what your strategy, could you describe your strategy?
So I'm not a spiritualist. I didn't come to this material because I wanted to, it was my belief system that I wanted to share with a wider public. I came to it because I was interested in it as a historical phenomenon. But I did try to be open-minded. I also felt that I wanted to be able to write a sort of narratively engaging account. So I did try and include, you know, many episodes that they were purported to have been involved in. And I would, you know, present the way that they presented it, but then give an alternative explanation as well, because I feel, you know, often the way they presented things didn't quite wash with me and probably wouldn't have washed with a lot of readers as well.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me a lot about histories of, for example, early modern witchcraft or Virgin Mary apparitions in the 19th century, and the way historians kind of have to deal with skepticism, right? But of trying to sort of walk that fine line between what the people of the past believed was the reality that they were experiencing versus the actual, you know, material facts of what may or may not have been happening. And it is partly what's more interesting is, you know, how everyone else was responding to these sessions and happenings, whether they believed it and what they drew out of it, the meanings they made out of it. Olivia, in your book, I think there's a kind of neatness to the narrative in that you chose the first three women who received medical degrees. So I have a sense that you had a kind of, that the framework was there for you to work with. But I did wonder, I mean, were there others that you would have liked to include in your book that ended up getting cut out of the narrative at any point? And perhaps I was also wondering which of your case studies you found the most unexpected in terms of the details you learned and the conclusions you ended up drawing.
Yes, my original proposal had many more women in it, and the universal feedback from editors was, this is too many, you need to trim it down. So yes, I would have loved to have written about many more women. I wanted to include the women in Pennsylvania who are nearby to me, and that would be easy to research. But of course, I chose the ones that I had to, fly to London and research there. But yeah, so they're the Women's College, Medical College of Pennsylvania was, one of the big reasons I wanted to dive into this topic in the first place. So I really wanted to write about their founding. That school was founded by men and women. It was a Quaker thing. So I really wanted to highlight a school that was founded by women for women. So that it made sense to kind of have the narrative of these three women who were such different personalities, having to kind of put those personal differences aside, and even differences of opinion of how, the movement should be working, how to go about achieving their goals of having women be allowed to become doctors and women be accepted as doctors in society. They had very different ideas about this, and they had to put those aside to, preference the establishment of a school where women could receive an education without men harassing them and throwing mud at them. They knew that this was more important than their differences of opinion. So that's what really drew me in to this story, was how different these women were, and from all different places, but that they had to work together to build this school. And there's just a lot of drama inherent in the story. And the more I dug, the more overlap I found. I couldn't believe how many times their paths had overlapped. They'd gone to each other's schools. Elizabeth Blackwell established a school in New York before she established a school in London. And Sophia actually attended that school in New York for a few weeks. Her father passed away, so she had to come back to England. She probably would have gotten her degree there, but there's so many levels of overlap that the more I dug, the more fascinating it was. Mm-hmm. The most fascinating person, just talking about what you were talking about presenting people historically. So when I sat down to write, my first thought is, okay, I hate when all these history books are talking about someone, but they don't address a certain aspect that's unsavory, right? So there was a biography of someone who was one of the main antagonizers of Sophia and the Edinburgh people, and his biography never mentioned the fact that he was, one of the main reasons that women couldn't get medical degrees at the time. He was a really loud voice in this movement, but that book never mentioned that. So I was frustrated by that. I want to write about the whole person. Like, there's going to be some things that these women did and said and thought that, we think of as maybe not okay anymore, or that just, I want to really paint them as a full human. I don't want to paint a savior. I don't want to paint a badass, empowered woman narrative. This is not reality, right? People are more complicated than that. So, but the more you dig and the more you become familiar with these people, and I just got really close to these subjects. I'm like, well, I don't want to write about something bad about, I really started caring about them, and I didn't want to talk about how, maybe Sophia was kind of mean and maybe she had a temper, but I think that embracing the idea that, people are three-dimensional, and you don't have to celebrate the bad parts, but you have to mention them. You have to address them to be authentic and to be a true, paint a true portrait of them. Elizabeth Blackwell had some not so great ideas later in life. She was sort of interested in the eugenics movement type things. She was anti-vaccines, but at the time that maybe wasn't such a bad thing, because they probably were more dangerous back then. But just the idea that I first, when deciding about who to talk about, my first criteria was I didn't want anyone that owned slaves. I didn't want anyone that was pro-slavery. There are some big things that I can avoid. I don't want to celebrate someone that was interested in slavery. And I think the main takeaway that I hope people get from my book is that sexism was never okay. We like to say that, that was like a historical norm. That's how it was back then. That's the same for racism, for slavery, that's just how they did it. Well, as long as they've been being sexist, being racist, there's been someone saying, this is not okay. This has never been okay. And we need to understand that.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. I mean, there's clearly in both of your books, although they deal mostly with the 19th century, there is a resonance and relevance to contemporary topics. It's very striking. Emily, in terms of your book, did you see a kind of resonance between 19th century spiritualism and contemporary society today that made you think that this topic was actually particularly fitting to study at this moment?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons it's always quite interesting to look at the Victorian era is it's a period of quite well, particularly in the United States and Great Britain, it's a period of great change, really, in terms of technology, in terms of exploration, in terms of political ideas. So one of the things that interested me thinking about the women in my book and the context in which they were working was that you had all this change happening, and then at the same time you had this movement going along with it, which I think it's easy now to look back on the 19th century and think, oh, people who went along to these seances, were they not perhaps a bit unduly gullible about things? But I think if you kind of put it into like the context of the time, if you think about some of the technologies that had come along just a little bit before the Fox sisters burst onto the scene, so I'm thinking about things like the telegraph machine or early photography, the idea that you could send a message from one geographical location to another, that quickly would have just seemed like just magic, just, a few years before. The same with photography, the idea that you could sort of have an image of someone that was there after they had been there. Again, this is like a very unfathomable thing. And, so it doesn't seem actually within that context that speaking to the dead, sending a message between the dead and the living is actually that much more of a stretch than sending a message over a great physical distance. So if you think about our world today, I think we are again surrounded by technology, change that has come on people quite quickly. I mean, most people, I think, use technology all the time in their day-to-day life. Most people don't have any real understanding of how it works. If you just think about this call that we're all on, I don't know about you guys, but I have really no idea how this is working. So I think, it's easy to think, we're so different from the Victorian era, people of that era. But actually, many of the things that they were trying to work their heads around are quite similar to things we're trying to work our heads around today. So I do see a parallel between those two contexts. And yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the things that drew me to that subject, kind of looking at the similarities, but also the differences between those two eras and how people responded to them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was... No, go ahead, Olivia.
Sorry. I feel like people are really looking for something to latch onto. And that's always been true in any era, right? They want to believe in something. They want to kind of immerse themselves in something. And Elizabeth Blackwell's sister got super into spiritualism. It was just kind of like a hobby. If you think about it, there weren't a lot of hobbies. We don't have all the media, that we have now. So it was just something to do, honestly. Like it wasn't like these people were crazy that believed in something like that. I feel like, but I'm sorry to jump in on your topic, but I just had been reading about it in context with it. It was just like something people want to do. And, Sophia talked about, going to one of these barns that was reportedly haunted and there was wrappings in it. So it was just kind of like part of the culture at the time, and it seemed normal to everyone.
Yeah, and I think there was a real social scene that grew up around spiritualism. So, people were drawn to it for different reasons, but Georgina Weldon, the last woman who I mentioned when I was talking about the characters in the book, I think, like you say, she was drawn to spiritualism initially, out of a kind of boredom with her married life. And, these were interesting places that you could go to. You could meet with different types of people than you normally would. Perhaps you could mix with, men and women mixing together in a way that would not normally be socially acceptable. So yeah, absolutely. I think that for a lot of people, it was their social life.
And one thing that I was thinking of in terms of spiritualism is that there is a, kind of recurrence of these moments of interest in the supernatural, mystical, transcendental aspects at moments of great change, as you were just saying, Emily. So, not just seances, but late 19th century, there's like this great interest in vampires. And obviously we just also in contemporary society had this big like vampire and zombies moment. And I think there's a kind of Freudian return of the repressed that is, that comes through in these moments that is certainly applicable to the way our contemporary society is sort of fixated on these, zombie horror films and vampires and whatnot. So Olivia, in terms of what you were saying at the end of the last question I asked you, and you were talking about, sexism in the past and now kind of glossing over it, but, kind of insisting that this was never okay and the hurdles that these women had to get across. There were sort of interesting moments in your book that I noticed where it's not just gender, but it's class and even perhaps race that kind of intersects in interesting ways. And I was wondering if you could just speak a bit more about moments when you saw those intersections coming through in your book and in the research that you did for it.
So I tried to include a kind of context for the way Elizabeth Blackwell as a physician was treating Black patients, Black women, and hiring Black physicians who had graduated. So medical schools for women were one of the first places to allow Black women to attend school. There were only a few colleges in the country that allowed Black people to attend at all. So you have, these really, really terrible doctors doing experiments on slaves without any kind of, sedation or medication. So if you put that's kind of the backdrop of where we're at in this era. And here's Elizabeth Blackwell. I'm not saying that she's like the best example. She's not the perfect person, but she is taking Black interns into her hospital. She's training them just like she would anyone else. She was raised in a very anti-slavery household. That was part of her upbringing. And when there was a riot, I think it was a Civil War riot about people being drafted. I think it was a drafting riot in New York outside of her hospital. And these men were angry about being drafted, and they were targeting any Black businesses, Black establishments, Black churches. And all the white patients were, and some of her colleagues at the hospital were like, we have to kick out all the Black patients. We can't, draw this riot to us. What if they burn our hospital down? And Elizabeth and her sister Emily, who both ran the hospital, were like, absolutely not. We're not kicking anybody out. So I liked to be able to celebrate those things. And I liked that not only is she advocating for women to have a greater role in just to be able to do any job they want to do, to have more access to education and more access to whatever profession, but she's also advocating for better treatment of people of all colors. She did medical practice. She did practice, I think it was in German. She spoke many languages, so she was able to treat these immigrants and really impoverished, terrible conditions. And she was really a forerunner of preventative medicine in this country, because she was really focused on teaching women and families about how to take care of your household, how to take care of your kids. She was really into like good food and lots of airflow. She was really interested in telling everyone that girls needed to be active and exercise as much as boys did. Like girls weren't allowed to be running around, during gym class or whatever. Like they didn't, and be involved in like the rough housing kind of stuff. She thought girls should have equal opportunity, and they really needed that exercise. She thought women should push back the age of their first pregnancy, so that to kind of give their body a break, so that because once you start having kids, you'd have a lot of kids. So she saw the true reasons why women were sick more often, and it wasn't because by the fact that they had a uterus. It was because they wore tight clothing, because they were being abused at work, because they were working in a factory with unsafe conditions. These things that male doctors weren't seeing, the being pregnant constantly. She saw the toll that this was taking on women's bodies, and that it was able to kind of, help for the real reasons instead of the kind of made up reasons at the time. And that's a thread that all of these women took up, and that they started applying, scientific methods to researching what women's bodies are actually about, instead of what men kind of decided that women's bodies were about. It's a really, really fascinating time in the history of medicine, and the way that it kind of really expands and jumps. And the irony being that all these medical breakthroughs happening in Germany and France at the time, and all of these women not being allowed to go to school in America or in the UK, and nearly all of them either got like a little degree and then went on to Europe, or they had to go to Europe just for the degree period. So they're studying at these places where it's, breakthrough technologies in medicine at the time, and then they're bringing it back to America. So because of sexism, they really jump-started and improved our medical care, especially women's medical care. But the fact that they were kicked out in order to do that, they had to travel, is not the best. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of technology they brought. I think it was one of Elizabeth's assistant, Marie. She moved to Boston and was asking one of the professors there to get all these equipment, and they were like, "Oh, we're not getting those newfangled European crap. We don't need that stuff here." So it's very, women bringing in the change, really improving the level of care.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Olivia. I mean, what you said brings me to, I think, one last question to wrap up our session as we draw near to the closing time here. Both of your books clearly have an activist agenda, I would say, in addressing issues of gender norms and equity. And I was curious, I wanted to ask if you could say a few words about why you look to the Victorian era to pursue this agenda, and perhaps if this will be a springing off point for a future book project that also looks at the 19th century and issues of equity as well. So Emily, perhaps we could start with you.
I mean, I think everything you write is always in some ways a springing off point for the next thing that you write, even if it's sometimes in quite subtle ways. I suppose I had written partially about the 19th century in the last book that I'd written. Obviously, I already mentioned that it was letters from Harriet Beecher Stowe to George Eliot that sparked my interest in the Fox sisters. So it is an era that I'm interested in anyway. I mean, I think to me, it's just a very fascinating era because in some ways, there are so many contradictions to the Victorian era because, in some ways it is an era of great progress, in terms of, like we've talked about already, discoveries and, you associate it both with progress and then also with so many things that these days we think of as dated and in many cases like quite shameful as well. So there's that interesting contrast. It's also an era in which we think women had, rightly, we tend to think women had very limited powers to find a public voice. Obviously in many places women were unable to vote, so they were unable to exercise their voice in that way. They were often physically unable to exercise their voice in the sense that there was still this, real distrust of women, getting up and speaking in public, particularly speaking in front of men. So again, I think it's an era of such contradictions that I think it's kind of one that's endlessly fascinating to explore as a researcher and a writer, and I feel it is one that I will kind of keep returning to in my work in different ways.
Thank you.
I feel like there's a lot of information. There's a lot of sources to be found. Honestly, it's a really rich era to be digging around because there's so many fascinating stories and there's just so much. I write a newsletter about women in history and the history of science. And I've written about women like ancient Greek, there's not a lot of stuff there, but you can find, there's enough for a book, for a little post, there's not enough for a book maybe. But yeah, I would love to write about the women in early modern and medieval times who were essentially providing full medical care to their families as that's kind of like an expectation of the household. Like you find these recipe books from these eras and they have recipes for medicines as well as for foods. And so it's, the evolution of healthcare there. But again, it's, whether you can find the real narratives, the letters from these actual people that to stitch together a real story that has insight, it was much easier in this era. And I felt like, to me, it was when women were kind of starting to really demand more and finally being heard in that way. You've had feminists throughout history, but this is when women were like, okay, we're done. We're not having this anymore. We're gonna start changing things. And so that to me is the fascinating part, is that they're actually making those strides. They're actually breaking into colleges. They're actually getting into things and making change. My next book is about 4 women physicists who were had to flee Hitler's Germany. So I am changing eras in my next book, but sticking with the overall topic there.
Thank you so much, Emily and Olivia, for sharing your work with us today and your thoughts on them. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for this panel. If you're interested in purchasing these books, you can click on the green button that you should see in the Crowdcast window. Emily and Olivia, we look forward to following your work in the years ahead. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.